Well, Richard, what can I say after that? Thank you very much. You flatter too much. Thank you all very much. I know it's a small room and a big crowd. I'm just wondering if perhaps we need a circulation of air to keep this door open. Otherwise I shall be facing some dozing faces in a few minutes perhaps. I have really rather kind of interpreted my brief liberally. When I committed to doing this talk, I had a really rather precise sense of what I might do, but then realizing that I want to try and sell Irish urban history or aspects of Irish history to, I know, some people who may not be entirely familiar with what we have been doing or should have been doing. This is going to be rather broad, rather more discursive, rather more eclectic, and I really only, I think, perhaps do justice to the title in the latter stages of my talk. Now, I have a paper, and I hope you'll bear with me if I largely read from the paper, because otherwise I shall drift really dangerously off topic. So, as I say, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's very nice to be back here and to sort of have the challenge. And Richard, you are far, far too generous in your remarks, and anything but the kind of productive dynamo that you seem to be suggesting I am, faltered along and been rather lucky in some of the breaks I've had over a long academic career. And I have actually managed to take my retirement, but that is only this year, so I'm now hopefully going to be more productive. Well, on Monday of this week, the 4-volume Cambridge History of Dublin, 4-volume Cambridge History of Ireland, I should say, was launched in Dublin Castle with its 103 early stage, late stage, and senescent contributors who had been whipped by a remarkable editorial team into delivering on time. The 4 volumes are mightily impressive. Happy days. But across the 4 volumes and the 100 plus chapters, there's not a single one that formally addresses urban history or historical urbanism in Ireland, helping thereby to perpetuate the old canard that Irish urban history is a thin story of little historical depth or significance. Now, the 40-year-old Irish Historical Atlas project that many of you will know of, or at least the International Historical Atlas project of which is part will be familiar, should have dispelled such a notion. And we might also, I suppose, have expected that the excellent 2 volumes of comparative essays on British and Irish early modern urban history, published by the British Academy almost 2 decades ago, would have generated fresh research and greater interest in archipelagic 4-nation urban history. But with a few honourable exceptions, cross-channel urban inquiry has been left to art and architectural historians and to students of book history and print culture to pursue with serious intent. It's most timely and welcome that Erica, Hannah and Richard have been guest editing an Irish issue of Urban History. For in all its years, the journal has published only a tiny number of articles on Irish urban history, and nearly all of these are post-1840 themes. No fault at all of the editors, but a reflection of what's been going on, or not going on, out there. Now, I've rather dubious credentials to be sitting here posing as an urban historian, Irish or otherwise, or as someone who can pass judgment on the meta-narratives of Irish urban history, because my own research interests, as I think Richard has just mentioned, were shaped a long time ago in the kind of hothouse days of economic and social history, when proto-industrialization was a new word, and when we associated Languedoc with Emmanuel Lavallerie and not Michael O'Leary. In other words, like a number of other Irish historians of my generation, we hovered at the gates of urban history, occasionally entering to take the archival treats before retreating to worry about rural demography or the price of butter. But having committed some years to trying to do for Dublin what Roy Porter did so excellently for London, in other words, to produce an academically informed but accessible metropolitan biography of the Irish capital, I've become detained rather longer within the ramparts of urban history than I'd intended. Now, the precursor to my general history was the remarkable study of Dublin 1660 to 1860 by Maurice Craig, written in 1952 and loosely modelled on Summerson's Georgian London. Craig's witty, insightful and elegiac study of the city has never been out of print, and while dated in its wider judgments, it's remained the canonical work on Dublin's architectural golden age. Craig was also a poet and a prolific photographer, and this view, looking south down Dominic Street, lying within Dublin's inner north side, was taken in 1946. It's a suitable point of departure for us this afternoon, revealing that one legacy of 18th century urbanism was, well, 20th century slum housing. Dominic Street, with some of Dublin's finest stucco interiors, was speculative development of the 1760s and 70s, large plot frontages and a broad carriageway erected by a variety of builders on what had been an old city lane, on which one Christopher Dominic, a city physician, had built a detached house half a century earlier, and which was integrated into the new street. As in similarly scaled developments further east and across the river on the Fitzwilliam estate, the early residents in this street were a mix of MPs in the Irish Parliament and middling gentry, with a scattering of wealthy merchant families and a coachmaker or two. But even in the early years, lawyers made up half the householders in this street. At first sight, this had not changed much by the mid-19th century. In 1855, the Duke of Leinster kept a townhouse at number 13, but gentry families were now completely outnumbered by professionals, principally lawyers, although many of these were only working in the street and residing now in suburban townships. The tenementization of the street hadn't yet started, not until the 1880s it would seem, and it never took complete hold. And by 1946, the time of Craig's photograph, the street was on the cusp of great change, with the great public housing initiatives from 1948 about to draw out thousands of inner city tenement families to healthier but ill-designed suburban satellites to the west and north of the city. And indeed, most of Lower Dominic Street here was demolished in the late 50s, in other words, about a dozen years after this photograph. Solid local authority apartments were built in the early 60s, which replaced the 18th century shells, and these themselves are now, in the present era, partly demolished. Soon all are to go, with the street the focus of a major regeneration initiative. And indeed, the new North-South Dublin Lewis tram runs down the middle of the street. Thus, while there is some truth in the popular narrative that Dublin's urban palaces of the 18th century flipped into becoming the worst slums in Western Europe, while there's some truth, the process was really a slow one. And the TB-ridden street caught in Craig's camera was at a particular low point in its long history. Now, Craig's archive is actually stronger on small town Ireland than the cities. The market house of Dunlavin of circa 1743 still stands, 70 years after Craig's visit, in what is now within the commuter belt of Greater Dublin. If I say to horse lovers, this is quite close to the Curragh, you'll know more or less where I'm talking about. An unexpectedly massive structure. It's attributed to Richard Cassell, the most prestigious architect active in mid-18th century Ireland. Dunlavin, the town, village at that stage, was one of over 750 or so urban settlements across Ireland, identified in the first edition and Ordnance Survey of the 1830s and 40s by Brian Graham and Lindsay Proudfoot, that displayed, as they've argued, morphological evidence of formal planning intent and or infrastructural modernisation. 750 urban sites across Ireland that seem to have had some planning from the cartographic evidence. And they've estimated that the planned character in 4/5 of that 750 or so such towns and villages was a result not of medieval or plantation actions, but late 17th, 18th or early 19th century interventions. Now Dunlavin, with its wide streets, its cruciform pattern, which is in Census captured in the building itself, and its extravagant market house, was unusual only in the level of investment evident in its inception. The ground landlord, Sir James Tint, was a veteran MP from Cork when he inherited the Dunlavin estate through his mother's family in late middle age. And given that he was a founder member of that great institution, the Dublin Society, the RDS of more recent times, his market house was perhaps not such a surprising gesture. And although the town of Dunlavin had nearly 3,000 inhabitants by the 1840s, it remained incontestably a seigneurial town when the market house had to be extensively repaired 90 years after its construction. It was Tint money again that paid for it. Most such market and court houses, profusely evident in the first edition of the Irish Ordnance Survey, have been demolished or integrated into other public buildings, or worse, or simply mouldering away. Happily, the Dunlavin one survives, not quite as pristine as it appears there in 1947 or 46. Now, the received wisdom, as far as planned villages and estate towns in Ireland are concerned, has long been that these were almost entirely the initiative of improving land owners, anxious to promote artisanal industry and the settlement of industrious migrants, and that the economic logic underpinning such a policy was flawed, and that their role as catalysts for industry and improved farming was for the most part a forlorn failure. However, as Graham and Proudfoot argued in their work that's now about 20 years ago, landlord intervention has been exaggerated. It was only a part of a much more varied story, with estate policies rarely explaining long-term urban outcomes. Some initiatives may indeed have failed, but estate investment, even with failures, had strong collateral effects, perhaps benefiting others than the ground landlords. Now, from across the country, and I realise I'm assuming intimate knowledge of Irish geography here, so bear with me, and I try and fill in any gaps. But across the country, let's take from the west the case of Westport, County Mayo. It's North Mall, appearing quite clean in this image from the 1890s. This is not Craig, but an earlier photographic archive that we have in the National Library. This town was indeed initially established as an estate village on the magnificent edge coast of Clew Bay by the Brown Kelly family in the 1750s. Dominant local proprietors and beneficiaries of Jamaican slave plantation, the Browns, future Marquesses of Sligo, invested heavily in altering the flow of the local river and creating a new town plan with malls facing each other across the tree-lined channel. Now, whether James Wyatt, employed to remodel Westport House in 1781, and you can see the wider village, or rather the town as it was by the 1840s, and Westport House there on your left. Whether Wyatt had anything to do with this remains a tantalising possibility. Westport became a handicraft linen town quite quickly, helped by the inflow of South Ulster migrants fleeing the Armagh pogroms of the 1790s. Between 1785, the rental coming in from town tenants grew from a mere £119 to 30 years later, in 1815, £1,329 from the Westport archives. Westport, in other words, had a town that more than paid for the investment that was associated with the Browns. It was reckoned an improving town not just because of the micromanagement of the ground landlords, but also because of the supply of prospective tenants willing to build and extend in the town. In a sense, Westport was at the far western edge of what we might call the Ulster linen economy, and it's far outside Ulster, but that sort of Ulster-centred linen economy, which out of small beginnings in the Restoration period had shaped the commercialisation of peripheral counties in the northwest and west of Ireland, and stimulated small town growth. And I'm thinking of counties like Donegal, Cavan, Leitrim, Monaghan, Longford, and west to Sligo and Mayo, all touched by, and more than touched by, the linen industry. Now, it was apparent to even the most casual 18th century visitor to Ireland that Ulster, or at least the linen heartland of Ulster, was slightly special, was slightly different, that the towns there were more solidly built and more diverse in their trades, even though they were often smaller than equivalent towns in the south. Now, here we have from the 1890s Lawrence photograph of the market house at Newton Ards, an example. Newton Ards, built, remodeled by the Stewart of Ards estate, the market house and assembly rooms dating from the 1760s, designed by a Bristol architect. It's certainly unusual in Irish terms in its scale and quality of finishing. Quality of finish, I should say, reflecting the capacious political ambitions of Robert Stewart, Viscount Castlereagh's father. But given the prosperity of the Ards hinterland at that time, it was not, that is, the market house was not wholly out of place. And again we see something of how it fits into the town plan of the 1760s and 70s. In other words, a very prosperous hinterland close to Belfast Lough. But perhaps we should place all this in context. By the time of the first completed national census of Ireland in 1821, the proportion of the island's population recorded as living in towns and cities of over 2,000 inhabitants. Now that's a low threshold, I know, for urbanisation, but taking the 2,000 bar, 13.5% is the figure we get from the 1821 census. We've no earlier estimates to compare this with, but it's plausible that the urban share had climbed from very low early 17th century levels to reach this proportion probably in the late 18th century. It's also likely that the spurt of rural population growth and the rustication of industrial employment that had sort of kept the urban share at about that level from the 1780s, 1790s. I mean, this is speculative, but there's very little change in the urban share between 1821 and 1841, time of rapid population growth. But in 1841, the share of 2,000 plus in towns is about 13.9%. Now thereafter, while the reported urban share rose in each decennial Irish census to reach 33.5% in 1911, national population was, of course, declining throughout the period. And that means that a very large proportion of these towns were actually losing population, albeit at a slower rate than in the countryside. 99 out of 139 towns and cities with a population of 2,000 and over in 1841, 99 out of 139 were actually smaller in 1911 than they had been 70 years earlier. Urban population recovery over much of the country only resumes in the 1930s, and in some cases not really until the 1960s. In archipelagic terms, such a 19th century trajectory is remarkably different, of course, from that in the British domains. Now, this greatly weakened momentum of Irish urbanisation tend to mask the prior long cycle of growth that's a sort of focus today. And I am happy to use the term Renaissance about that earlier growth because it in turn has some echoes, at least in the east and south of the country, of a much earlier urban cycle that we can perhaps simply call the long 13th century. Kilkenny, the only inland city of any consequence in 18th century Ireland, had deep medieval urban roots that were physically evident at least up until the late 18th century. This 19th century lithograph of a 1760s drawing of the city's High Street and Market Cross is quite suggestive. Now, the 14th century cross, which had survived Cromwellian vandalism in 1650, was finally removed shortly after the drawing for street widening. In 1771, the stones were lost before it could be re-erected elsewhere. Now, that wasn't, in 1771, an act of iconoclasm, but one of civic improvement. Now, Kilkenny's modern historian, the late John Bradley, has contrasted the violent displacement of elite families around the time of Cromwellian taking of the town, the 1650s, with civic continuity under the surface. I quote Bradley: "Appropriation of the structures of power and symbols of wealth endowed the new regime in Kilkenny with legitimacy. The families at the top might have changed, but otherwise here it was business as usual." So looking forward from the 1650s. I think I would say not quite. For the 18th century, Kilkenny expanded far beyond its medieval boundaries and was an unusually diverse urban economy, becoming really from the 1720s a real beneficiary of the growth of the capital city, growth of Dublin, 70 miles away, using Kilkenny as a source not just of foodstuff, of grain, or flour, of black marble, and indeed of column for malting that comes from the Kilkenny coalfields. So Kilkenny is a kind of interesting and case of an urban economy that's certainly growing long before the later 18th century, when others seem to change most rapidly. Now, moving back to the east coast, Drogheda is another early 13th century foundation and an occasional rival of Dublin, and had once been the frontier town for those trading with pre-plantation Gaelic Ulster, with its economy continuing to be triangulated between South Ulster, the Boyne Valley in its own hinterland, and Lancashire and Cheshire in the short sea crossing. Drogheda wasn't a county town, but it had some of the characteristics of a residential leisure town, even at the time of Ravel's 1749 map. However, its commercial and manufacturing success a little later, in the late 18th, early 19th century, made it a far less salubrious place. And I'd say it's one of the larger Irish towns crying out for more research. I'm generalising, knowing the limitations of my knowledge of Drogheda, and it's a really interesting case, relatively well documented. But in the precise era of Peter Borsay's English urban renaissance, it's really the four large ports of Belfast, Waterford, Limerick and Cork that should attract our attention. Belfast was, of course, a 17th century foundation, but the southern ports, Limerick, Cork and Waterford, were and are proudly pre-Norman in their origins. Now, before the late 18th century, I'm sorry about the quality of that image, before the late 18th century, Cork's growth was remarkable. What you see there from this 1602 map is a very modest walled town. And for those of you who know Cork, it's really the western side, the southern side of the walled lozenge is on your left, and St. Finbarr's is up there at the edge of the image. But I'm really showing that just to illustrate how small Cork at the beginning of the 17th century was, a embattled walled town, and indeed underwent considerable destruction both in the 1640s and when the future Duke of Marlborough besieged it in 1690. But its growth was really from the mid-17th century, and particularly from the 1690s, capitalising on its success both as a regional capital and as the predominant conduit for the export of butter and beef products to colonial markets, English, French, Portuguese and Dutch. And I can use this dangerous implement now just for 1 second. This is your walled city of Cork, that we've just seen in 1602, and this is the city of 1756 where it's seen great reclamation downstream to the east of the city, running what becomes the South Mall, Grand Parade, and the canal here becomes the future Patrick Street of the 1780s. The great centre for the beef slaughter trade was on the north side here, Blarney Lane, Mallow Lane, etc. Textiles more associated with the southern suburbs outside, and also a great centre for brewing and the barracks there. Although the one great brewery that survived Beamish and Corfins was actually inside the old walled city. So John Roke's map of the 1750s, showing a city that has become a very major Atlantic port, and indeed almost a claustrophobic city nonetheless. One of the few open air amenities of the 18th century city was the Meerdyke, or the Mardyke, a promenade built in the 1720s along an embankment over regularly flooded ground just upstream of the walled city. A private gesture by a senior member of the corporation, although I think a tea house at the far end of the walk may have helped him to finance it. Now, Limerick was slower to come back to life. Again, a medieval city, of course, and the streetscape of its old medieval core survived into the 19th century, although here it's the site of post-1690 Dutch-style townhouses that caught 19th century artists' eye. But Limerick, specifically Newtown Perry, was the site of the most radical 18th century urban redevelopment in an Irish city outside of Dublin. Like more famous new towns on this side of the channel, Newtown Perry, sketched out here and planned by Christopher Collis in 1769, took some 60 years to be realised, and it largely was realised along those lines. And I think it's really perhaps remarkable that, given the difficulties which modern Limerick has gone, that the architectural legacy of that 18th century Newtown, in terms of its brick terraces and gridiron street system, survives as very visible. And the shape of that is very evident to the most casual visitor. Now, Limerick was, for much of the 18th century, Ireland's third city, and striking redevelopment from the 1770s reflected its role as a regional gateway to the Lower Shannon region and its attractions as a residential leisure town, catering for the deepening pockets of the half-gentry and the squireens from across the region. Fourth in rank size for most of the century was Belfast. But with a population of just under 20,000 as late as 1800, this was very modest beside Cork, well behind Limerick or even Waterford at times, and a tenth the size of Dublin in 1800. At the time of Wilson's map here in 1791, I beg your pardon, its middling orders were still predominantly Presbyterian, albeit coldly separated into old and new light factions, with an Anglican establishment trying to cling on to the government of the town. But there was now a small but growing Catholic substratum. Held back for much of the 18th century, or the first half of the century, by the imbecility of the town's proprietors, the Chichesters, the physical development of Belfast had really surged forward from the 1760s. But commercially, Belfast had been one of the most adaptable Atlantic ports in Ireland, with well-established and intimate transatlantic links before the American Revolution. Now, at first sight, it might almost seem an offshore Scottish port city. The linkages with Glasgow and Edinburgh were very real, yet among the many distinctive elements of Belfast's 18th century history was its flamboyant reception of first American, then French revolutionary ideologies, and its influence, Belfast's influence in disseminating Jacobin and Republican ideas across a large swathe of the country was hugely important and very different, arguably greater than that role of the capital city itself. The printing presses of both Belfast and Dublin were vital in this process. And as it happens, all of the urban places we visited so far, Dunlavin and Newton Ards, Limerick, Cork and Westport, all were directly touched by that radical tide and that flowed into the bloody events of summer 1798. Indeed, the chief estate agent in Westport had been an active United Irishman for years, unknown to his employer. Perhaps this helped to ensure that the town was largely undamaged when it was briefly held by the French during General Humbert's short invasion of August-September 1798. But to return to Belfast, Belfast was on the cusp of transformation into a manufacturing town at the time of Wilson's map, and its 19th century trajectory of physical growth and social reconstruction created a very different town, even before the arrival of shipbuilding and engineering. It's really only from the 1820s that we can confidently say that the urban history of Belfast and East Ulster sharply diverged from the rest of the island in its demography and cultural dynamics. But keeping our fix firmly in the 18th century, long or short, is it possible to isolate the effects, the legacies of that distinctive cycle of urban growth that seems to have stimulated every urban settlement, about the very smallest, and with the exception of Belfast, to have decelerated in the second quarter of the 19th century? And more specifically, can we see anything distinctive in those legacies when measured against the urban processes in other countries? So, Richard, I'm really getting back to what you asked me to do at the, 3/4 of the way through my talk. My apologies. So, I suppose I'm really sort of thinking through this. What is distinctive? What is important? Given that this was a cycle that sort of had an end, other than perhaps in the case of Belfast, it is more of an expansion, not an inversion. So I really want to suggest what the ingredients of that debate might be, given that this was Ireland's second wave of urbanisation from the early 17th century to the early 19th century, later and weaker than that in Scotland and England, and in much, of course, of Western Europe. But the rate of change, albeit from low levels, was impressive. From region to region, once it got going, impressive even by Scottish standards. And there were, of course, powerful linkages between this momentum and the solid expansion of Irish external trade in agricultural goods and obviously in linen throughout the 18th century. There was also a complex linkage that I won't try and go into now between the urban expansion and the exceptionally high rates of rural Irish population growth evident at different start-off points in the 18th century, but you could say generally evident from about the 1740s. Parallels to that conjunction, rural population, rapid population growth and urban expansion are not, of course, hard to find across pre-industrial Europe. But what makes the Irish case perhaps a bit more distinctive is the ethno-religious mix. After all, town government, wholesale trade, and the professions were mainly, in the period we're thinking about this afternoon, in Protestant families' hands, whether of English, Scottish, Huguenot, Old English or Old Irish background, in nearly all the larger towns at mid-century at least, and Catholic townspeople, at least until the Relief Acts of the early 1790s, were excluded from the formal perquisites of citizenship and guild membership. The pervasive ideology of economic improvement, both in town and countryside, shaded all too easily into religious assumptions about the barbaric unreformability of Catholic belief and practice. And it was rare indeed before the late 18th century to find Catholic advocacy of or involvement in urban improvement. Now, admittedly, the Browns of Westport were a converso family in the previous generation, and the new resort town of Killarney, County Kerry, created de novo in the 1750s and 60s, was a pet scheme of the Catholic Viscount Kenmare. But Catholic landowners were indeed a rare breed. However, from the 1780s or so, Catholic mercantile wealth began to pour into urban land speculation and construction, and in every major town apart from Belfast and Derry, Catholic craftsmen, land agents, surveyors and builders were in the ascendant, soon to be joined by an abundance of Catholic lawyers. Now, the religious composition of Irish towns varied enormously. And this process of urban, what I call recatholicization, occurred at different speeds and with different consequences. Some, like here, the town of Ennis, county town of Clare, had always had the thinnest of Protestant veneers. Just mentioned there, this is an 1820 image of the market house that had been built, interestingly, by resident landowner Francis Bindon, architect and landowner in the 1730s, in the early 1730s. Francis Bindon, a fascinating figure on many counts. And Ennis is a fascinating town that's been quite well served in recent historiography. But as I say, it's a case of, if you like, a very Catholic town in a very Catholic county, County Clare in the west of Ireland. But a contrast might be the plantation town, wall plantation town of Bandon in County Cork, well known to Richard, where the business and prestigious handicrafts remained in largely Protestant hands until the early 19th century. But the elements of 18th century urban cultural change, familiar to everyone here, to English urban historians, such as the enlargement of the public sphere, the diffusion of Enlightenment ideas of behaviour and deportment, the new opportunities for bourgeois women in trade and in the informal side of local politics, the lightly regulated press, the transformation of print culture, the rise of the shop and the new world of discretionary consumption. These were all present in Ireland too, but they evolved in a rather special habitat, one where urban communities were profoundly divided by religious affiliation. Not at this time conflicting or contesting communities, but this asymmetry did leave its mark. Now, Rosie Sweet has, for instance, contrasted the abundance of urban town histories written in 18th century England with their almost complete absence in 18th century Ireland, and seen this in terms of the possible absence of a sense of urban community or communal identity or sense of a shared past in Ireland. And that's probably true. Although I suppose I would just say yes, but you do have an interesting profusion of published town maps and topographical paintings of Irish towns that were commissioned by corporate or private patrons. And how widely known they were by the townspeople is another question. But if we focus on the final decades of the 18th century, from the era of the volunteer movement in the 1770s down to the eve of the 1798 rebellion, we can see signs of communal convergence, perhaps best captured, I'm sorry I haven't got an image here of it, by the celebrations in the city of Derry in November 1789, on the centenary of the commencement of the great siege of Derry in 1689. Now, this 1789 centenary was marked by the opening, unveiling of an almost triumphal new city gate, entrance gate in Bishop Street, into the walled city. Now, the interesting thing is that celebration in 1789 was graced, overseen by the Anglican bishop and the Catholic bishop. At least the Catholic bishop certainly took a prominent part. The Anglican bishop, the Earl of Bristol, was a slightly larger-than-life figure. But there, in a sense, you have, we might say, the apogee of 18th century kind of communal sharing of a past. There are other examples, but that's a particularly nice one that we can document. Now, in the next generation, after 98, after the Anglo-Irish Parliamentary Union, the Evangelical Revival, the decades-long parliamentary battle over Catholic emancipation, the civic atmosphere was very different. The restoration of the parliamentary franchise to Catholic freeholders in 1793 didn't affect corporate politics directly, but the religious question dominated county and city electoral contests for 3 decades and more, and the toxic rivalries of those years hastened the splitting of civic society along denominational lines in most cities and towns. Again, this is not unique to Irish towns, and doubtless similar divisive patterns emerged, for instance, in parts of Central Europe in the 19th century. But it was stark indeed, coupled as it was with the growing visibility in 19th century towns of state apparatus, whether the post-Union county courthouses and jails, beloved by Richard, the asylums and workhouses, the barracks and constabulary post, all agencies answerable to a London-centred state, not to Dublin, certainly not at once to the local gentry. So things have felt different. But there were, of course, other distinctive legacies that I very briefly touch on. Urban Ireland was a germination ground not just for subaltern Paynight politics in the 1790s, but was a platform for the new politics of mass mobilisation, beginning with Daniel O'Connell's first great campaign in the 1820s. It was urban wealth, urban personnel, and urban infrastructure that made possible that great popular push for emancipation. Indeed, it was his quondam ally, Fergus O'Connor, who went on to apply some of those techniques in the glory days of Chartism in the north of England. And that, I think, alerts us to the liveliness of print culture in 18th century Ireland, evident certainly in Dublin since the 1710s and 20s, particularly we would say since the days of Jonathan Swift and the Drapier's Letters, with a newspaper press thriving despite periodic heavy-handed interventions by Parliament and government, as here in 1784, when Matthew Carey in the Volunteers' Journal published his woodcut, not very subtle attack on Speaker Foster. Now, the printer publisher of the Volunteers' Journal was a Catholic baker's son, and really stirring it up against a key member of the de facto Irish cabinet, leading to press censorship and to Carey's forced flight to America, where he became a most successful publisher and bookman for the next 40 years. Dublin was, of course, the second most prolific centre of book publishing in the 18th century English-speaking world, but it's the vitality of the news sheets, the ephemera, the cheap works of devotion, the ballad sheets, the poorly documented chapbook production that's particularly tantalising. That low trade was predicated on a language shift that's difficult to document, although we have some clues. But we certainly know that bilingual competence was growing from the early 18th century. Mapping that process, as I say, is problematic, but urban culture and printing was almost entirely in English. And there were certainly far more French language titles produced in Dublin than ones in the Gaelic Irish language. Language patterns in wholesale trade, local government and the law were similar, entirely Anglophone. So we can see that the countryside in at least two of the four provinces was heavily bilingual by the late 18th century, and the towns certainly were, though it seems that Irish remained the prevailing language of the street and the informal sector in Cork, Limerick and Galway until much later. Nevertheless, I think through a multiplicity of urban conduits, a language revolution was underway. Now, 18th century Irish towns had no formal poor law system to fall back upon in the hard years, and there was no fully fledged workhouse in any city until the 1770s. Here I ask you to recall the poster that we've used for this talk. My image of it is at the beginning of my slides, so I won't go back to it. But I think what's interesting is that there's a precocious development of medical charities, first in the capital city, and others soon followed. My image was of Dr. Stephen's Hospital, still standing, and constructed in the 1730s with its archaic French appearance, its quadrangle. There was a gift of a wealthy, childless physician and his widow to the city. A decade later, the lying-in hospital, the maternity hospital, associated with Bartholomew Moss, established on a Parisian model, which from the 1750s operated in a purpose-built Palladian palazzo, which we know as the Rotunda Hospital, and backed by a revenue-generating pleasure gardens behind it. And contemporaneous with that was Swift's great asylum for the mentally ill on the edge of Dublin city, again funded posthumously from an ample personal estate. Hospitals, maudlin asylums, houses of industry, all were initially funded by patronage of part-resident rich and indigenous clerical, professional and commercial families. It's difficult to compare the scale of this kind of voluntary charitable investment with contemporary British patterns, but the impression certainly is that philanthropy was noticeably strong in Irish cities, in an environment where poverty, be it cyclical, seasonal or imported from the countryside, was never out of sight. Now the twist in this story is a way in the 19th century that voluntary charitable organisations, by then with a strongly denominational identity, competed for funds and for influence, whether in education, medical provision or poor relief. And out of this competitive environment were forged a series of powerful organisations, most notably the lay Catholic societies and associations that evolved to become religious orders of at first national and then transnational influence throughout the British world, such as the Christian Brothers, starting in Waterford City, the Presentation Order in Cork City, and the Sisters of Mercy in Dublin. And although influenced by older French orders, notably the Ursulines here, who were invited to Cork, where they'd transformed an old Quaker merchant's house in suburban Cork into a prestigious school for girls. This image is from about 1830. The culture of these Irish-based religious organisations never completely lost their urban bourgeois origins. So that certainly is one of my legacies. Another very different legacy lies in the artisanal culture of 18th century Irish towns. This is perhaps a little bit more speculative, but it suggests that a distinctly assertive role of Irish men, and it is mainly men, in English and Scottish trade associations and unions in the first half of the 19th century reflected not just their absolute numbers here, reflecting the prolonged decline of many workshop crafts in Irish urban centres in the first third of the 19th century, and the migration in very large numbers of textile, metal, leather operatives across the Channel, including the farriers here. This is an image from about 1790 that was in an Irish Dublin auction house last week. I'm afraid it went for too much for my pocket. But it does at least capture something of 18th century artisanal culture. Now, the point I'm really trying to make is that these Irish operatives in English trade societies brought with them an associational culture that was a little bit different. There's a long experience in the Irish urban journeyman societies and clubs that were tightly organised, particularly in the second half of the 18th century, arising from the experience of sharp wage fluctuations, incremental de-skilling, and the growing issue of what were known as colts, in other words, country craftsmen competing and undercutting agreed city wage rates. In other words, the kind of formidable defensive power built up in particularly the Dublin journeyman association that's very evident from the 1760s and 70s onward. Some of them have become, of course, very politicised in the 1790s. But born out of the kind of economic environment at the turn of the century, they are formidable even for the likes of Daniel O'Connell to do truck with. And I think certainly there is something interesting exported from the Irish urban environment into Britain, into England and Scotland from that. Which leads us to a final legacy from the 18th century. The way in which short distance migration to the Irish towns or through the towns had served as an apprenticeship for the great migration of later times. Here we have James Beale's evocation of Shrove Tuesday on the South Mall, or looking down the South Mall, which I picked out a few minutes ago in Cork, a night of carnival celebrating an entirely rural Gaelic Catholic tradition, turning on the ban on the celebration of marriage during Lent. And here you have a no doubt disapproving George II looking down on a Bruegel-like night of music, rurally inspired. And perhaps, given the year 1845, the last such occasion in which that carnival was held. 1845, indeed, was the year that some would say marked the end of Ireland's very long 18th century. But that's another story with a different kind of twist, which I shall leave there. Thank you very much.